we've got a mobile screen here that you sent over to me, and I'm basically going to go through and I'm going to ask you questions about any details that jump out to me because I want to find out about the decisions you were making that led to these sort of results.
Yeah, sounds good.
Before we start, do you want to give any background about the app and this screen in particular?
Sure. Yeah, it's an app that a friend of mine is making. He has a version out in the App Store that's very different than this. Very what I like to call developer chic. He's an iOS developer, so didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about the design. So we've been working on. I've got a project that he's helping me develop. So in exchange, I'm helping him design this project, and it really came out of his own experience. He presents a lot at meetups, and he was looking for some way to easily see when participants raise their hands in a Zoom call, and or are muted or unmuted. So it's kind of a way to bypass the Zoom app and just have something that he can just set up on his phone or iPad, kind of easily see. So we came up with this term, a heads-up display for Zoom. So there's not really interaction on this particular screen. It's just something you set up and can view. So that kind of created an interesting UX challenge, right? Because it's got to be like noticeable. You don't want to linger too long on it, but it's got to like catch your attention enough. And it's kind of just like a view only screen, although there is a couple of interaction bits that I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah. Well, I like the idea. I mean, I don't want to get too much into product stuff here, but it clearly shows there's a problem with the Zoom app if you need this sort of separate displays to solve this problem that Zoom probably should be solving itself. So I quite like that challenge, So yeah, I'm going to generally start top to bottom, and ask you about anything that pops out to me. I'm going to start with a couple of things that you've sort of laid out here, just to make sure I understand what they are. So this title at the top, I assume, is the name of the meeting.
Correct. Yep.
And this counter here, I'm assuming that's just a time the meeting's been happening or going on for.
Yep.
Okay, so the first one that has, well, actually, I'm going to ask about, because it's already up here, the time, but I noticed it down here as well. It's quite a interesting typeface for the timer. And I don't know if it's the same typeface as the text, but I was curious about your choices here.
Yeah, definitely. It is the same. It's SF Pro, which is Apple's font. Which I'd actually never used it in an app. So I often will use a custom typeface. I'm usually resistant to using SF Pro or Roboto for Android, just because every app kind of uses, or a lot of apps use those. So I think it's kind of like goes back to my print days. I actually started my career in print, so it was very much typography focused, and every new project was like, okay, cool. What new cool font can we use here? So I typically like to do that, and I'd like to see more apps do that. There's a ton of great fonts out there, but for this one, I chose to use SF Pro partly because the developer I'm working with on this, it's his app, he brought that to my attention, and what you see with the number is an extended. It's SF Pro extended,
right?
Which I didn't know existed. So yeah, I think it kind of worked well. I was initially resistant to SF Pro, partly because it's kind of I don't know. It's just sort of, I don't think bland is the right word, because it's just a very functional app. It's not anything special, and that's kind of its purpose, I think, is just to sort of blend in the background. But I think when I saw the extended typeface, I thought, okay, this should be fun. I can work with that.
Yeah. Okay. And I just realized if I'm going top to bottom, I probably won't ever ask about this because it sits in the background, and that is the sort of blob gradient effect you've got happening here. I noticed there's some red down here. I'm wondering what the process was to land on the background sort of style you ended up with.
Yeah, I started with just like a dark gray. It wasn't quite fully black. I knew I wanted to do dark mode, which sort of came from whenever you use like start a call on an iPhone or a Zoom call, you kind of, when you're in the call, you're in dark mode. So I had this thought of like, okay, I use dark mode when you're in the call, and then light mode when you're setting up the call. So it started off with a dark background, and it was just, I just wanted something a little more interesting. It was kind of just a purely aesthetic choice, and I had recently seen, I don't remember who it was on Twitter, someone posted this tutorial about how to make these kind of complex gradients in Figma, where you use a layer blur. So I was eager to try that, and I tried it, and just kind of like made some shapes back there, and yeah.
Was there any logic behind the color choices for that gradient, or just what seemed nice at the time?
Yeah. So I had actually pulled, when I had the thought about using the gradient instead of just a plain background, I had pulled a screenshot. I just kind of did a Google search, found a stock image, and pulled it in there. And I think that I kind of just made that decision quickly. I just searched probably for just a few minutes and found something I think I had in my mind that I was, kind of using this, what I call like indigo theme. So like the color of the timer, sort of this indigo, which I like to use. It's not quite purple, not quite blue. So that's sort of the base color. And just sort of just kind of, so I sort of based the new gradient on that screenshot that I found. That was, the colors were a little more vibrant here, so I kind of brought the vibrance back a little bit.
Right. Okay. You've got the leave button here. It's not solid like, for example, this Sarah Diaz row is. It's sort of got a solid outline, and then I'm assuming a slightly transparent background. I'm curious about that choice as well, if you could tell me more. Yeah.
That button, I really started with the, I initially had that button in the bottom, and it was kind of the main button on the screen, because I thought, okay, you're really just going in there, and the only thing you can do is leave. So then this timer came up. So that the timer was just this idea, if you're presenting and you want to kind of have your own personal timer. So with the timer, I've got the more opaque button there, the red. So I didn't want to use the same, boldness that you also see on the Sarah Diaz line. I wanted it to just be a little more subtle, but enough to see it and notice it, but it's not the primary kind of feature of the app. It's something that you really only use once during a session when you're ready to leave. So I wanted it to sort of fade in the background a little bit, but it's still like you want to get it easily when you need it, but it's not, you're not thinking about it until you need it in that moment.
That makes sense. Yeah. I mean, speaking of red, you've talked about the leave button and the stop button. They're both red. And I think I understand the reasons they're red. I understand the reason why Sarah Diaz is red less. So I was curious about that choice.
Yeah. So this was kind of the most fun part of this, was coming up with these different states in this list. So you can see here, you've got the first line is a state, Mohammed's line is a state, Jeremy's line is a third state, the next line is a fourth state, and then there's a fifth state. So this was kind of the challenge of this app, and what was fun about it is to distinguish between all of these states. So the whole point of the app initially was to show you have this list, and when someone raises their hand, they want to ask a question, it's going to come up. And then so there's sort of varying levels of like alertness, like, hey, notice me. And that the top one, we felt like that was the most important, that someone has their hand raised and they're muted. So if you're presenting in a Zoom meeting and you see that, it's going to really alert you. And if you say, hey, Sarah, I see you have your hand raised, do you have a question? And you don't hear Sarah, you can notice that and say, hey, Sarah, you're muted. This happens all the time in Zoom meetings.
Yeah. You have to point out someone else's mistake to the
Right.
person who's holding the meeting. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. And so I'm assuming yellow is for the same reason, because it grabs your attention just like the red.
Yep, definitely. So the yellow grabs your attention. It's a little different than the others. And there's also, a few visual things to reinforce that. Obviously the hand, at first glance, you can, even if you squint, I do this a lot where I'm like designing screens, I'll squint, see, okay, if you squint, you can see that these two hands really pop out, which is what you want them to do. You want, if someone has their hand raised, you want to be able to see that. So a couple things that I've thought about since I designed this is, maybe that red is a little bold, because often if you're in a Zoom meeting and let's say you have your hand raised, you're usually muted until you're ready to talk. And then right before you start talking, then you unmute. So
right. Yeah.
it may be, I may revisit that. And I would have to come up with some other way to show that this is a different state. Because I think initially I just had the two at the top, and they both looked like Muhammad's line, kind of the lighter background, yellow, and then it was just the icon on the right that helped if they were muted or unmuted. So I wanted to just do something a little extra to see that, to differentiate that state.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Between these list items, including this sort of count at the top, you've got these black dividers. I'm curious about why the decision to use dividers rather than just separate them by color difference.
Yeah. We actually had a version. So when the developer was making it, this was always in the original design, but we had a version where the developer didn't have the lines in there yet. And I don't know if he just missed them or hadn't coded that part yet, but I did like it at first, the simplicity of it. But I think ultimately I stuck with the lines just as another way to differentiate. And it's subtle too. It's not, especially on the dark background, it's not, I didn't want the lines to like really, so if I used like a totally white lines there, you'd sort of notice the lines more than anything. So yeah, I felt like it was just a subtle way to distinguish between these rows.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the black versus white issue, so I'm glad you brought that up. But no, that makes sense. Okay, so I assume these green bars, do they represent sort of audio or volume? They represent the microphone being on, essentially? Right, okay.
Yep. So you can see the differences there. And the thought is that, you can see it's based on if they're talking or not. So if they're not talking, the lines would be shorter to show that someone's muted, they're unmuted, but they're not really talking. Or what sort of came later with the developer as we were building this, I was starting to think, well, this could be used for anyone in a Zoom meeting, even if you're not, in a meetup or something, even just your regular team meeting. I've been in lots of meetings where, uh, you know, we have like a standing team meeting every week, and someone's dog is barking, or they're in a coffee shop or something. And so showing this mark would be a good way to see if you pop in there and say, "Hey, Jeremy," and Jeremy's not talking. You might say, "Hey, Jeremy, will you mute?" Because oftentimes people, and myself included, sometimes I'm not I'm unmuted and I don't realize it, or I don't realize I'm in a loud place. So that's just another little cue there. So it's
Yeah.
almost like another state that you're unmuted, and then there's like two substates in there where you're talking, or there's noise coming from where you are or not.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I think I've had that happen quite a few times. Never from me, obviously. I'm a Zoom pro, but from other people. I think there's a bit of a theme, but I've noticed you've got these borders around these buttons as well. I'd argue in this case, especially if I think there's one here for the white button. They're even more subtle than the darker lines between list items. I'm curious about why you kept those when it's such a high contrast with its sort of violet background.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's something that I've done recently, like with other projects. I'm kind of on this little trend of using these borders, and typically with the buttons, I'm using them in a way so the borders are low contrast. So when you're looking at it from a distance, you almost can't tell that that there's a border on the red or the white, and it just sort of, it's like something that I use sometimes in lieu of shadows, just to give the button a little bit of depth, but I do it in a really simple way. So I think part of it's just a sort of a leftover from that. But that's an interesting call out. I hadn't really thought of the how those are low contrast and everything else is higher contrast.
Well, no, I think your reasoning makes sense because it doesn't really stand out, but it does add some contrast to the border,
right?
Especially in the red, makes it slightly sharper.
Yeah, I could maybe go a little darker on the gray there. Yeah.
Well, I think that's everything that jumps out to me, and it makes sense. This is a shorter walkthrough because it's a shorter screen essentially than the others I've done. But is there anything else you wanted particularly to call out?
Yeah, I think we covered the states. That's an important part of it. I'm sort of doing something here where so like Aaron Odman, Gary Nickel, Megan Kennedy, these are all my old coworkers at my old company, so shout out to them. So those are transparent, and then there's kind of varying levels of, so Jeremy's like maybe like a 20% white, Muhammad's maybe a 40%, and then Chad's line is darker. So kind of a fun way to simple way. Like I've often with these screens, I think about the developer too, and I'm usually in conversation with the developer a lot, and just thinking about like easy ways for him to implement it. And it kind of seemed like a simple thing to do that gives a nice effect, but still kind of has the transparency coming through. You can still see the gradient coming through, which is fun.
When you took, let's call this the base background for a list item, when you took that base background and then layered on that transparent white, and then again even brighter transparent white, I assume, to make them stand out more, do you have a process for choosing how much extra white to add?
There is a process. There's always a process, but a lot of it is I do a lot of eyeballing. Like I'm kind of try something, look at it on the screen. That's an important part of the process, is to, almost like if I'm designing this screen in a day, every few minutes I'm going to the app. I'm using the Figma mobile app to see it on the screen, kind of live with it. I'll take a walk, kind of look at it in the sunlight, and just sort of always kind of be going back and forth, because it's always different, right? Like if you're working on mobile especially, I mean, on desktop you're already on a desktop, but if you're in Figma, but on mobile, it's something about it. It's like the colors, the sizes, everything is just, you kind of look at it with new eyes when it's on mobile, or when you see it on the actual device. So that's an important part of the process. So yeah, it's sort of that, try something, look at it, adjust it, look at it again, adjust it, go to sleep, wake up the next morning, look at it again, adjust it, take a walk. And then that's usually my process. And then I'll kind of land on something that looks right.
Yeah, I know that real designers go to sleep in the middle of the day to really speed up that workflow.
Exactly.
Between each iteration, they're having a nap, so you need to pick up the pace.
Yeah.
Well, fantastic. I'm going to wrap things up there, and thank you once again for sharing this with me and talking through the details. It's like I say, it's my first mobile screen in this series, so it was quite fun to dive into what is a more expressive app than the previous screens I've walked through with people.
Very good. It was fun.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, once again, and I hope things go well with the app.
Yeah, thank you.